everybody, Tom Barnes, Stories from the 78, and it's winter time, and as we all know, especially here in the Midwest and other parts of the world, winter, can be long and in many cases dark just because of the way where you live and the sun and the whole thing. I have my friend here, her name is Lewellyn Melnyk, and Lewellyn is a former journalist, but now a farmer, and you started off living on a farm when you were a child, and you went off to university and did your media career, and now you're kind of back to your roots. Did I get that first part right? I just want to make sure.
You absolutely did. Yep, that is exactly right. I did grow up on a farm, went and found kind of my career path, and then ended up back on the farm. So that's where I am now.
So, and you wrote a book, and that's why we're talking, and you talk about your journey. Why don't you tell folks the name of the book and how they can find it really quick, and then we'll move forward with your story, because I think it's a wonderful story to tell.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So my book is called Rooted: How I Stay Small Town Strong When Life Gets Hard and How You Can Too. So this is the book. So yeah, I wrote this book basically because I have struggled with mental health for the entirety of my life. And I have really worked hard at trying to improve it and find ways to make myself healthy. And so I, as a child growing up on the farm, dealt with depression when I was 12 and was to the point where I was suicidal. And it was a very difficult time for me, but also for my family, because we were isolated and we didn't have a lot of resources. And my mom did what she could for me to try and find help. And some of that included hormone therapy as a child, and doing some tests and doing some other things. But there was a void there. There was not a lot of help and not a lot of support when I went through it.
And being
Luckily,
well, I was gonna say, being isolated, explain to folks where you were in relation to Canada, just so they have a general idea, because I think if you tell them where you were, I mean, that will give a sense of that isolation.
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm just north of Russell, Manitoba. And so it's about 2 hours from the US border. We're smack dab in the middle of Canada on the Canadian prairies. I grew up on a grain farm. And so in our town, the population was around 1,800 people. That would include, surrounding areas. We had a hospital that's really good at acute care, but didn't have a lot of mental health strategies and support, and especially back then. And so when I said it was hard for me to get help, we did get some help from a pediatrician and we did do some things, but I did struggle for a long time, and there was not the support that maybe I needed. And so it took some time for me to kind of dig myself out of the hole with some help. And I struggled for a long time. And, eventually I did move away from the farm. I went to university and then I went to college. I got my media production diploma and I got a job. I got a career in media and I loved it. It was great.
Right. You were like an anchor, right?
Feeling good. I was a TV news anchor in Brandon, Manitoba at CKX Television. It was the job of my dreams. I love telling stories. This is something you do. You know what it's like. I love telling people stories. Yeah.
So then
great.
if you had all that and I'm guessing at that point too, you were feeling really well about yourself, your mental health was probably strained in other ways than maybe growing up on the farm, because we all know in like media, that's also a grind. But it sounds like you were at your happiest, or at the time you were really happy, and then you decided to move back to the farm, right?
Yeah. So what's really funny is, yes, I was at my happiest, but I learned how to work really hard growing up on the farm. And so when I found my career and I was in it, I worked to the point where I would work myself just to exhaustion. I would burn out. I would completely put myself into my job and work as much as I could. And so it got to a point where I knew I had to leave my job, and not because I didn't love it and not because I wasn't good at it, but because I didn't know how to step back and look after myself. And so I got back to a same place where I was struggling a lot. And at that same time, my husband and I decided, well, boyfriend at the time, that we were going to get married, and he was a farmer. And so there was no moving to the city for him. His
Yeah,
farm
that's
was
a
his
no.
farm. And if I wanted to be with him, I had to move back to the farm. So that's what I did. And it was, I think, the toughest decision, but the best decision for me. Um, and then when I did move back to the farm, I, went back into all of my old ways again. And so we started having kids. I had two kids and I was farming and I was doing everything I did on the farm, and I had two kids, and then I wasn't taking breaks, and then the anxiety hit again in my 30s. And so I was just, constantly in a rotation throughout my life of struggling with my mental health. And so finally I just said, this is enough. I need to fix this. I need to do something about this. Um, and so one really cold winter, my husband and I went away on vacation. I needed a break. I was just totally burnt out.
Yeah,
And we went
sure.
away for a few days. My mom and dad watched the kids. We went to Jamaica for 4 days, which is not very much. But at that time, it was like, I just need to get away. And the mom guilt was bad because I was like, I don't want to leave my kids. They're small, but I need to get away. And so we did. And it was such a whirlwind to be away for 4 days. And when we came back, I had a massive panic attack on the airplane. I passed out on the airplane. I had no idea what was going on. I had never had one before. My face had went numb, and I said I wasn't feeling good, and I didn't know what was happening. And so we got home and I went and saw a doctor, and the doctor said it was anxiety. Well, I just decided, okay, this is enough. Like, I've dealt with this. I'm done doing this to myself. This is enough. And I don't want to feel like this anymore. And so that kind of started my journey about, how am I going to get better? How am I going to get mentally well? And this book is about how I did that. And it kind of lays out a framework for people who might be struggling on how to get help, even if you live in rural communities, even if you're isolated, even if getting help looks a little harder where you live than other places, that you still can help yourself, and you can improve your mental health. So that's what this book is about.
And I thank you for sharing that story. And it's got to be scary to have something where people might say, well, it was just a simple panic attack. It's not simple if your face is going numb and you pass out, though. That's terrifying, because that I'm sure that you thought maybe something else was horrifically wrong, like you were just terrified. And to be able to share that, especially from, I mean, you said you were contemplating suicide at 12 years old. That is such a awful thing for anybody to contemplate, but I can't imagine a 12-year-old thinking about that, just because you're not at your full mental development as an adult. And it's amazing that your parents were able to get you whatever help that was needed at the time, because you're sitting here talking to me now. So, and when I was reading about your book and about what you do, it says that agriculture, I should say, is one of the top 5 occupations with some of the highest death rates by suicide. So, it rings true for you, especially because I'm sure growing up in that community and being part of that community now, that's something that you've heard about, where you were probably like, I had no idea that this person was suffering or having mental issues with the job and that way of life, because that's what you kind of talked about prior, is that way of life of sacrificing yourself for the betterment of the farm.
Yeah. And look, it's a great life. I don't want to
Right.
tell you that
Yeah,
it's
sorry.
not. It is. There are so many benefits to living on the farm. But I will tell you, you can't go home from work. You live at your work. Those boundaries are really hard for farmers. The other thing is, and you just said it, talking about when you're struggling, that's something a lot of people just don't do in the agricultural community. We're tough.
Sure.
Farmers are tough.
Yeah,
We don't talk about our
absolutely.
feelings, and we don't talk about those things. And so we have to talk about those things, and we also have to feel those things. And sometimes you have those bad feelings and you kind of want to put them to the side. And it's really good on the farm because you can be busy all the time. So you don't have to feel those things. You can just get to work and do all the work you have to do, right? So
Sure.
yeah, I think that it's great to tell my story because I think a lot of people are struggling in silence, and those statistics do show it. There was a survey done in 2020, and 58% of farmers classified with varying levels of anxiety. So that number is just too high. And why aren't we
Yeah.
talking about it? I don't understand. Like, we need to talk about it. If that's the case, let's talk about what we can do to get those farmers feeling better.
Yeah, here in the States, I know that mental health has been something on the forefront lately. And it's the same thing. People don't want to talk about it. Work settings up until recently really didn't want to acknowledge it. Insurance companies don't want to cover it. And that's slowly changing here in the States, but it needs to change worldwide because we see the things that go on in the world where there's mass shootings, a lot of that happening here in the States for one reason or another, but a lot of that is tied to mental illness. And, so much of that, I shouldn't say so much of it, some of it at least can be curbed with proper treatment, talking about it, at least making it bearable for people where they are not out of the reality that we all live in here, where they come to a place where they either want to hurt themselves or hurt others. So I think sharing your story is wonderful. And one of the things I wanted to ask you before we're done here, what was the hardest thing for you to share in the book? Like, that might have been the most beneficial to share, but it was terrifying to do that.
I'm definitely talking about being suicidal as a child. That was
Yeah.
definitely the hardest. I mean, nobody wants to share that story. That's something that hurts. It will always hurt. Me talking about it is going to be healing for me, obviously, but it's not easy to talk about. It's not easy to write about it. I think sharing my story, though, holds a lot of value, and I think there is strength in doing that, because if I can hear somebody else's story and go, oh, I'm not alone, then I can share my story and somebody else can feel that way. And that's what I've always felt. When somebody has shared their story with me, it's always makes me a little bit more calm, makes me feel a little bit more normal. I'm not the only one going through this. And really, that's my intention with this book, is that, look, I've gone through this. I know by the statistics, there are a lot of people going through this. And so let's just talk about it and let's look at what we can do to make everybody feel better. I mean, I don't know what it's like in the States, but I know here in small towns, what are one of the things you do when you're out and socializing? We drink.
A
It's a
drink.
culture of drinking. What
It's here
does
too.
drinking do for your mental health? Drinking is terrible for your mental health, but it's something that's what we do in small towns. It's one of the first things you do when you start socializing is everybody has a drink. So, I mean, that's one of the things I talk about in my book, that, there are lots of easy things you can do to improve your mental health. And maybe it's not picking up a drink when you go out, or doing something
Exercising a
as small
little
as that.
bit. Yeah, exercising a little bit just to, change your body chemistry and use those endorphins. And I guess also probably, being out. If you are in a setting that you live on a farm, what kind of farm is it? First of all, I didn't even ask you, like, because I imagine that
Okay, so we have
also
a
is tough.
grain. Yeah, so we have a grain farm. It's about 3,500 acres of grain, and we grow wheat and canola, sometimes oats. So my husband and I farm with my sister-in-law and my nephew and his girlfriend, and my mother-in-law is here. So we all farm together. My nephew and his girlfriend and my husband and I, we do the grain. His my sister-in-law, does cattle. So there is cows on our farm. We don't do too much with them, but there is cows around. And my kids raise chickens. So we have about 16 hens, and that's about all we have for animals. But yeah, it's busy here in any season. And so it's fun, it's great, but it can be stressful too. So
Yeah, but I imagine in that part of the world as well, being out in the summertime, especially where you have those long days, short nights type of vibe, I imagine that also in itself, just going through a walk on the property is a good reminder that sometimes that's all you need, just to step away and not try to think about work, but enjoy the beauty that is around. I'm guilty of it here. I live in Chicago, which is the third largest city in the States, and it's a concrete jungle. So I have to try to like get to the forest preserve to just walk and be with nature. And that makes me feel, as much as working out does, sometimes it makes me feel better. So any little bit helps, I think. And I think your book will
yes.
help so many.
The nature part is huge. And so that's something I talk a lot about in my book is our connection to nature. Look, like back in 1925, 30% of people were farmers. That's a good chunk of our population. Now we have less than 2% of the population are farmers. So you know what? The other 98% still eat, but our connection to nature is a blessing for this 2%. And it holds, it's a big responsibility. So with that, you know, comes a little bit of a burden as well. And so sometimes we counter, you know, environmentalists who maybe say that we're maybe not producing food the way that they like or think we should. And that's part of my book too, you know, to shed a light on this is how we produce our food. It's safe. We're stewards of the land. The things that we do here are, you know, we're growing food for everyone the best way we know how. So it's advocating for farmers, but that nature component is a huge one. And so I always talk about how being in nature, you know, if you said it yourself, if you go out for 5 or 10 minutes and you go for a walk or you're outside, you automatically feel better. And that's a huge component. And so I touch on that lots in my book, that nature is so important to our mental health. You said the other one, exercise. I write a lot in my book about exercise. I found running as one of the greatest things that helped me. Running really truly saved my life, and I will be a runner for life now because I will never stop. If I stop, I know instantly if I don't get my exercise, I feel like crap. So yeah, all of those things I touch on in my book, and those are simple things we can do, and it doesn't matter where we live. We can go outside, we can go into nature, we can go for a walk, we can get our exercise. And so some of those things, it is going back to basics. And a lot of the things in my book are, let's go back to basics. What do we need? What are the basic fundamental things we need for good mental health, and how can we get them?
Wonderful stories and great advice, Lewellyn. Thank you so much for telling your story. It's brave of you to tell it and put it in a book and come on here and talk with a stranger. But I do appreciate your time. And for people who want to find the book, again, say the website for me, if you would.
So the website is lewellynmelnyk.com, and pre-orders will be available there. The book comes out on February 7th.
Fantastic, Lewellyn. Thank you very much for your time, and wonderful talking to you.